Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, may I ask you to take your seats? The program is about to begin. Mr. Secretary General, President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, Holocaust survivors and your families, Second World War veterans and your families, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Melissa Fleming and I'm moderating this ceremony today. I'm Undersecretary General for Global Communications here at the United Nations, and it is my great honor to welcome you to the annual Holocaust Memorial Ceremony at the United Nations, organized in observance of the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. In 2023, the United Nations Holocaust Remembrance and Education is guided by the theme, Home and Belonging. Victims and survivors had their homes and sense of belonging ripped from them by the perpetrators of the Holocaust. The violence of that exclusion began with disinformation and hate speech. These phenomena lent support to systemic injustice, discrimination, and marginalization, which ended with genocidal killing. Now it is our responsibility to do everything that was not done then. Counter all attempts to reduce and degrade human beings. Counter prejudice, hate speech, anti-Semitism, as well as Holocaust distortion and denial. And do whatever we can to prevent any next genocide. Today, we are so pleased that we can welcome you all on this cold January morning, the sunny January morning, and especially Holocaust survivors who are with us in the General Assembly Hall of the United Nations headquarters in New York, as well as those of you who are able to tune in and watch this ceremony from around the world via our live stream. We are deeply humbled and grateful to have you with us today. We will begin today's ceremony by observing together a moment of silence in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. May I ask all of you who are able to please rise. Thank you, everyone. And now be seated, please. It is now my honor to introduce the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres. Secretary General, the floor is yours.
Dear Holocaust survivors, dear members of families of Holocaust victims, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I want to begin by expressing my deep gratitude to the survivors with us at the United Nations in New York and to those who join online. You give meaning to our work to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to defend human rights and dignity, to strive for justice and peace. Your testimonies shocked the conscience of the world, and your courage, resilience, and endurance continue to inspire us. So, from the bottom of my heart, I want to say to you, thank you. Excellencies, 90 years ago this year, the Nazi Party came to power in Germany. Within months, they dismantled fundamental constitutional rights and paved the way for totalitarian rule. Members of parliament were swiftly arrested, freedom of the press abolished. In Dachau, the first concentration camp was built, and in Berlin, books were piled on bonfires. And all over Germany, violent anti-Semitism became official government policy. discrimination and exclusion codified in law began almost immediately. Open organized violence, most notoriously the terror of the Kristallnacht, followed soon after, alongside widespread theft and plunder. And then the systematic mass murder started. By the end of the war, 6 million children, women and men, nearly 2 out of every 3 European Jews had been murdered. Excellencies, the rise of National Socialism in Germany was made possible by the indifference, if not connivance, of so many millions. We now know the terrifying depths of the abyss into which Germany would plunge. But the alarm bells were already ringing in 1933. Too few bothered to listen, and fewer still spoke out. Today, we can hear echoes of those same siren songs to hate. From an economic crisis that is breeding discontent, to populist demagogues using the crisis to seduce voters, to runaway misinformation, paranoid conspiracy theories, and unchecked hate speech, to growing disregard for human rights and disdain for the rule of law, to surging white supremacist and neo-Nazi ideologies, to attempts to rewrite history, deny the Holocaust, and rehabilitate collaborators, to rising anti-Semitism and other forms of religious bigotry and hatred. And at its essence, Holocaust remembrance is a call to be on constant alert, never to be silent in the face of hate, never tolerant of intolerance, never indifferent to the suffering of others. And after all, hatred does not start in a vacuum. The Nazis did not invent anti-Semitism, eugenics, or notions of racial supremacy. The Holocaust was the culmination of millennia of anti-Semitic hate. Throughout history, the hatred that begins by declaring, "You have no right to live among us," sooner or later says, "You have no right to live." So, Excellencies, the painful truth is that anti-Semitism is everywhere. And in fact, it is increasing in intensity. Over the last year, Orthodox Jews were assaulted on busy streets in Midtown Manhattan. Jewish school kids bullied in Melbourne. Hateful banners hung on a freeway bridge in Los Angeles, and swastikas spray-painted on the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. Survey after survey arrives at the same conclusion: anti-Semitism is at record highs. And what is true for anti-Semitism is true for other forms of hate. Racism, anti-Muslim bigotry, xenophobia, homophobia, misogyny. Neo-Nazi, white supremacist movements are becoming more dangerous by the day. In fact, they now represent the #1 internal security threat in several countries and the fastest growing. From Christchurch to Buffalo, from El Paso to Oslo, with targets from mosques to synagogues, refugee centers, and grocery stores. And we are not just facing violent extremism, we are increasingly facing terrorism. The threat is global and it is growing. And the leading accelerant of this growth is the online world. Today I'm issuing an urgent appeal to everyone with influence across the information ecosystem, regulators, policymakers, technology companies, the media, civil society, and governments. Stop the hate. Set up guardrails and enforce them. Many parts of the internet are becoming toxic waste dumps for hate and vicious lies. They are profit-driven catalysts for moving extremism from the margins to the mainstream. By using algorithms that amplify hate to keep users glued to their screens, social media platforms are complicit. And so are the advertisers subsidizing this business model. That is why I've called for regulation that clarifies responsibilities and improves transparency. We know how easily hate speech turns to hate crime, how verbal violence breeds physical violence, how diversity and social cohesion are undermined, as are the values and principles that bind us together. That is why I launched the United States Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech to provide a framework for our support to member states to counter this scourge while respecting freedom of expression and opinion. As part of our common agenda, I have proposed a global digital compact for an open, free, inclusive and secure digital future for all, firmly anchored in human rights. And I've also called for a code of conduct to promote integrity in public information so people can make choices based on fact, not fiction. We all have a role to play. We can never let hate have the last word. We cannot allow old hatreds to find new outlets and impunity on digital platforms. And together, we must confront falsehoods with facts, ignorance with education, indifference with engagement. Because never again means telling the story again and again. Mesdames et messieurs, nous devons raconter l'histoire des personnes persécutées, les massacres des Roms et des Sinti, la torture et le meurtre des autres victimes des nazis, les personnes en situation de handicap, les Allemands d'origine africaine, les homosexuels, les prisonniers de guerre soviétiques, les dissidents politiques et des milliers d'autres encore. Et surtout, nous devons raconter l'histoire de tous les enfants, femmes et hommes victimes d'un massacre en règle qui ensemble formaient le mosaïque foisonnante et florissante qui était la vie juive en Europe. Nous devons nous remémorer l'Holocauste, non pas comme l'histoire de 6 millions de morts, mais comme 6 millions d'histoires différentes derrière chaque mort. Souvenons-nous par exemple de Janusz Korczak, médecin polonais, éducateur et directeur d'un orphelinat à Varsovie. Il refusa à plusieurs reprises de s'évader du ghetto de Varsovie pour rester auprès des 200 enfants de son orphelinat et les accompagner jusqu'à Treblinka afin qu'ils ne meurent pas seuls. Souvenons-nous de Friedel Dicker-Brandeis, qui enseignait l'art aux enfants du ghetto de Theresienstadt et les encourageait à peindre ou à dessiner afin que, ne serait-ce que l'espace d'un instant, ils puissent se sentir en sécurité. En 1944, Friedel et ses élèves furent assassinés dans les chambres à gaz d'Auschwitz. Aujourd'hui, alors que nous nous souvenons d'eux et d'innombrables autres hommes et femmes, nous sommes également invités à réfléchir sur la responsabilité qui est la nôtre. La responsabilité d'honorer la mémoire de celles et ceux qui ont péri, d'apprendre la vérité et de veiller à ce que personne n'oublie jamais, ni nous, ni les générations futures, de refuser l'impunité des responsables, où qu'ils soient, de s'opposer à tous ceux qui nient, déforment, relativisent, révisent ou justifient de quelque manière leur propre complicité ou celle de leurs parents ou grands-parents à propos de l'Holocauste. Celle, enfin, d'intensifier nos efforts de prévention pour défaire les préjugés, résoudre les conflits et régler les différends avant qu'ils ne dégénèrent. En ce jour et chaque jour, renouvelons notre engagement à lutter contre le mal sous toutes ses formes et à œuvrer en faveur d'un monde où règne la paix, les droits humains et la dignité pour tous. Et je vous remercie.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your remarks. And it is now my honor to invite His Excellency, Mr. Csaba Kőrösi, President of the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly, to deliver his remarks. Your Excellency.
Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, Some of us in this room knew the horrors of Holocaust better than anyone. Survivors of that immense tragedy and their family members understand better than anyone why we must remember its memory. And not just the memory of the ghettos, the deportation, the camps. The remembrances of all those whose lives were taken by senseless hate. The memory of those who knew, those you loved, those you lost, and those who could only live a tortured life when it was over. And the memory of those who helped Jewish families in the darkest days, when it was not without risk to provide shelter and protect, like my grandfather and grandmother. It is my honor to welcome you all here today in this institution and in a hall that was built to ensure that no one would ever see what you or your family had to see. Yet this year has begun amid new waves of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial across the world. Like poison, they seep into our everyday lives. We hear them from politicians, we read it in the media. We have seen pop culture leaders whose massive reach can influence and inflame millions at the touch of a button, making anti-Semitic remarks and sweeping hate. Deliberate denials and distortions of basic facts threaten the human rights of all around the globe. Monsters exist, but they are too few in number to be truly dangerous, Primo Levi once wrote. More dangerous are the common men and functionaries, ready to believe and to act without asking questions. The exhibit Unmask the Stereotypes on the ground floor offers a startling insight into how stereotyping, prejudice, and hate led to Holocaust. The hate that made the Holocaust possible continues to fester. And we can no longer ignore the clear links between extremist ideologies spreading hate online and their real-life consequences. With conflicts, wars, and atrocity crimes that continue to devastate nations and communities, we have to push back against the tsunamis of disinformation crashing about the internet. This is a responsibility that must be translated into action. Ladies and gentlemen, during the Holocaust, people outside the camps could not believe what they were hearing. But when the Sonderkommando photographers risked their lives to capture the horrors of Auschwitz, and then they smuggled hard evidence of the atrocities out of the camp, the world could no longer deny what was happening behind the barbed wire. Let us share their commitment to veracity. Let us channel their resolve. Let us reach for peace and justice for all. I thank you. Toda Rabba v'Shalom Aleichem.
Thank you, Mr. President of the General Assembly, for your statement, and I would now like to introduce His Excellency, Mr. Gilad Erdan, the permanent representative of Israel to the United Nations. Your Excellency, please take the floor.
Secretary General, President of the General Assembly, distinguished delegates, survivors and their descendants, scholars and honored guests, thank you for joining us today. I would also like to thank Undersecretary General Fleming and the UN Outreach Program on the Holocaust for their important work. Thank you very much. Friends, today we remember the darkest moment in human history. Within a few short years, the Nazis and their collaborators systematically murdered 6 million Jews. Individuals, families, communities, and entire towns, including my grandfather's wife, Bracha, and 7 of his children, my own aunts and uncles, literally turned to smoke and ashes, all due to burning hatred. Before I continue, I will add that my parents, Avinoam and Yehudit Erdan, children of Holocaust survivors, are here with us today, a symbol of resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. Yet, the hatred that my grandparents and millions of other Jews faced during that dark time wasn't born overnight. It was the result of evil lies repeated over and over again. The Holocaust began with words that quickly mutated into unspeakable violence. And now, only 78 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, these same words of baseless hatred are once again spreading across the globe like wildfire. Anti-Semitism is rapidly rising, and while it begins with words, we can already see the calamity's results. My people are being threatened, injured, and murdered solely for being Jews. In Israel, the Jewish state, innocent Jews remain the targets of terror. If any lesson was learned from the Holocaust, dear friends, it is to stand up for the Jewish people while we defend ourselves against violence. This is the true embodiment of never again. And friends, this ceremony's theme today is home and belonging. Home and belonging. Today, thank God, unlike during the horrors of the Holocaust, there is a Jewish state, a place for every Jew to call home. While Israel is the Jewish homeland, we must not forget what this institution is. It is also a home of memories. The UN was founded upon the ashes of the Holocaust. It was established to ensure that such darkness never befall humanity again. It is a living monument to the horrors suffered by the Jewish people all those decades ago, to the greatest tragedy in history. And as such, it is the UN's responsibility to lead the world in combating hatred. Yet today, when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism, sadly, the UN ignores its purpose. Educational programs are very, very important. Learning about history is crucial. But at a time when anti-Semitism is on the rise and Holocaust denial is spreading, I'm sorry, words are not enough. Verbal commitments are not enough. In the past year, what has the UN done to combat bigotry? There is a politicized, we all know it, an institutionalized bias among member states here at the UN. This bias is the source of the disproportionate number of anti-Israeli resolutions. And it is also the force behind inherent distortions, such as the Human Rights Council's anti-Semitic Agenda Item 7, mandating Israel bashing at every council session. So singling out the one and only Jewish state, yes, it is anti-Semitism. And on Holocaust Remembrance Day, it is our duty to call out this heinous double standard. But friends, when I ask what the UN has done to combat bigotry, I am not referring to the politically motivated anti-Semitism of member states. I am referring to the Jew hatred among UN employees, professionals, bodies, and agencies. What has the UN done to combat this bigotry? Despicable actions take place here that no amount of Holocaust outreach can atone for. Milon Kutari, a member of a formal UN commission, openly espoused the classic anti-Semitic canon, a libel reminiscent of the Nazi propagandist Goebbels. Yet, shockingly, Mr. Kutari still remains in his position while not a single statement has been issued by a senior UN official condemning his bigotry. The same can be said of Francesca Albanese, a UN special rapporteur who voices anti-Semitic falsehoods and belittles the Holocaust through distorted comparisons. Similar to Mr. Kutari, Ms. Albanese still remains in her role and has been met with zero UN condemnations. How about UN organizations such as UNRWA? Blatant anti-Semitism and Nazi glorification run rampant among its employees. I personally complained. Numerous complaints have been lodged, only to be met with no real response. When it comes to anything that occurs in Israel, this institution is very vocal and quick to respond and condemn. But when it comes to Jew hatred, the silence is deafening. Friends, this double standard is disgraceful. UN agencies such as OCHA and others use distorted methodologies to count Israeli victims and casualties of terror, minimizing their number. Over 1,000 entities around the globe have already adopted the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. Nevertheless, this institution, which should have been the very first body to adopt the definition, preferred to stand on the sidelines. In the very place that is supposed to set an example for the rest of the world, the tens of thousands of UN employees still don't even have guidelines defining what Jew hatred means. Mr. Secretary General, our dear friend, verbal support is a positive first step, and we commend you for that. But today, actions are needed. Actions are needed. Dear friends, today we commemorate the darkest stain in human history. We speak of never again. We give speeches of commitment, but as long as these words are not backed up by actions, they remain empty. We all know that the libels of anti-Semitism are always followed by horrific actions. So I ask that our words today, I beg you, that our words today also be followed by actions. The UN must remember its mission and history. It must take a stand against anti-Semitism rather than permitting it to fester and mutate into violence. This, friends, is our collective duty, and if you refuse to do so for my sake, do so for the sake of the 6 million. Thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, Ambassador Erdan. I would now like to invite our next speaker, His Excellency Mr. Richard M. Mills, Jr., who is the Deputy Permanent Representative of the United States to the United Nations.
Thank you, Undersecretary General. Thank you, Ms. Fleming, for bringing us together today. But most of all, thank you to all the survivors and family members present today to share their story of how the Holocaust impacted their lives and the lives of their families. For survivors of the Holocaust, as we know, returning to home, returning to life as it had been before the war, was tragically challenging. Some returned to find homes that had been destroyed, looted, or taken over by others. Others returned with the unease of knowing that many of their neighbors and friends had colluded with the Nazis or were silent as they witnessed the genocide. For many, finding a home, much less belonging, was not easy. In late 1945, facing U.S. congressional inaction, President Truman issued a directive reallocating immigration quotas to displaced persons. Later, the 1948 Displaced Persons Act pushed the door open a bit further, and eventually 140,000 survivors were able to settle and find home in the United States. But the United States was not always so welcoming. In May 1939, Hans Fischer, a 94-year-old survivor who now lives in the United States, fled persecution on the MS St. Louis. That ship, famously known, carried 937 German Jews seeking refuge, but it was turned away from Cuba and from my country, the United States. Mr. Fischer recalls the experience of reaching Cuba, where his father waited for him. His father and other family members rowed out in little boats to shout to their loved ones, while Hans waited for days in expectation of disembarking. It is beyond my conceiving how demoralizing it must have been for 11-year-old Hans to see Cuba and his father receding in the distance after negotiations to accept these refugees broke down. After the United States also refused to let passengers disembark in Florida, the ship returned to Europe, where many of the passengers lost their lives in the Holocaust. Hans Fischer and his family were blessed and fortunate. They eventually did reunite in Cuba and settle in the United States. In the United States, during the war, officials at the Department of State that I serve today prevented the entry of many fleeing persecution into this country, the United States. As the Nazis began to systematically round up and execute Jews, the State Department, which oversaw immigration and refugee policy, made it harder and harder for Jews to be granted refuge in the United States. The department did this by establishing onerous security checks, supposedly necessary to prevent enemy spies from infiltrating the United States. There was no evidence to substantiate these claims, and it is a stain on U.S. diplomacy that haunts me and my colleagues still. Today, many American descendants of Holocaust survivors, inspired by their family's struggle and courage, dedicate themselves to public service, fighting to advance human rights globally. Our Secretary of State and our Ambassador to the Human Rights Council in Geneva both have relatives who were Holocaust survivors. Today, as the speakers before me have said, Holocaust denial and distortion are on the rise, along with anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and nationalistic rhetoric. History shows, as hatred directed at Jews rises, violence and attacks on the foundations of democracy are not far behind. Unfortunately, the impact of these lives is magnified, as we have heard from others, via the internet and via social media. This is why our commitments under the 2009 Terrorism Declaration on Holocaust-era assets and related issues to promote Holocaust education, remembrance, and research are so important. The Biden-Harris administration is committed to securing a measure of justice for Holocaust survivors in the United States and around the world, and honoring the 6 million Jews, as well as the Roma, the Sinti, the Slavs, the persons with disabilities, the LGBTQI plus individuals, and others persecuted and murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. We must confront rising anti-Semitism and stand united against tyranny, against lies, against hatred, and all their forms. We must ensure that current and future generations learn the history and lessons of and from the Holocaust. It is vital that we confront this problem at this moment. 2021 was the highest year on record for documented reports of harassment, vandalism, and violence directed at Jews. In New York City, where this is taking place, anti-Semitic hate crimes were up 125% in November of 2022. Every day, we have a moral obligation to honor the victims, to learn from the survivors, and carry forth the lessons of last century's most heinous crime. From the December attack against 2 men with a BB gun in New York, to online anti-Semitic rants by celebrities, to dozens of swastikas painted in schools across this country, we are continually and painfully reminded that hate doesn't go away, it only hides. And it falls to each of us to speak out against the resurgence of anti-Semitism and ensure that bigotry and hate receive no safe harbor. At home and around the world, we must create a sense of belonging so that everyone feels safe at home. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Mills. It is now my pleasure to welcome Professor Renée Jolles. Professor Jolles will play Sorrows, Springs Are the Same, a piece specially composed by Dr. Victoria Bond for today's remembrance ceremony. Professor Jolles. Very much, Professor Jolles, for this moving performance of the premiere of Dr. Bond's composition. When words fail us, music can express our most profound feelings, and we appreciate your allowing us this moment to listen and reflect. The Nazis persecuted and systematically murdered Roma and Sinti children, women, and men. It has taken too many years for this part of history to receive the attention that it deserves. Our next speaker has contributed greatly to the effort to illuminate the history of persecution and murder of the Roma and Sinti during the Holocaust. I am very pleased to welcome Professor Ethel Brooks. Professor Brooks teaches at, you can clap, teaches, just a few more words about Professor Brooks, though. She teaches at Rutgers University, and she is also the chair of the board of the European Roma Rights Center and member of the Academy of European Roma Institutes for Arts and Culture. And in addition, she is member of the United States delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and its Roma Genocide Working Group. From 2015 to 2020, under President Obama, Professor Brooks was appointed to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. Professor Brooks is recognized internationally for her advocacy and commitment to the history and the future well-being of the Romani people. We are very pleased to have you join us today. Professor Brooks.
Thank you, Ms. Fleming. Secretary General, respected Holocaust survivors and your families, excellencies, Romale, friends, Teavan Bachtale. I'm here today to build you a home, to build with you a home. I'm here today to belong with you as part of a community of remembrance that continues across the decades. Together, we honor those whose lives were taken, those who were murdered at the hands of the Nazis and their allies. We honor those who lost family and loved ones. We honor those who survived and who built lives, who built homes, and who built community in the wake of genocide, even when the homes to which they returned after the war had been destroyed or taken away. Our acts of remembrance, our ceremonies of commemoration, continue the work of building home and creating belonging. I stand before you as a Romani woman, and for us, Roma and Sinti, home is family. It's our ancestors and our descendants. The network of mothers, fathers, grandparents, aunts, uncles, sisters, brothers, cousins, and children who help make up sense for us of who we are. Home is the stories we tell, and belonging is the community we build. Even as we have been denied homes, citizenship, and belonging, we come together to make home wherever we are, through our memories, our language, our Romani Pe, our cultural foundation, through our ancestors and through each other. Home is in our names, given to us by our communities, and home is in the ways that we see each other, recognize each other, and share with each other. Excellencies, across the centuries, we, Romani people, Jewish people, all those whose lives were deemed not worth living, have been told that we do not belong, that we do not have a home. The Holocaust was part of that larger history and continues to this day. Every time someone is told, wherever they are, you don't belong here. The continued persecution and violence that Romani people face across Europe and beyond are long-lasting legacies of the Holocaust. And we must work together in official commemorations, in everyday acts of remembrance, and in the defense of rights to document the atrocities that were carried out against our people and to recognize and honor the victims and the survivors. Recognition also means standing up for those who continue to face violence and persecution, to fight against racial and ethnic violence, and to remind the world of the brutality and discrimination which, regrettably, Roma, Sinti, and so many others are subject to this day. For our communities in places like Belgrade and Thessaloniki just this past month, people have been murdered and violence has been rained upon homes and communities in various parts. Friends, this work continues, and this fight for a better world for everyone is the home that we create together. Today, we come together to commemorate all those whom we lost, we honor those who survive, and we continue to build home together. For the hundreds and thousands of Roma and Sinti murdered, for millions of their family members, and for all of us, the Holocaust took away our sense of home, even as the Nazis and their allies took away its possibility. In the face of violence, murder, and genocide, we have continued to build home. We have made home through love, through remembrance, and through calling upon one another. And in this moment, I want to pause, and I want to remember and recall not just the hundreds of thousands of us who were murdered, not just the millions of people who were murdered, but specifically, I want to recall the names and the lives of two of our foremothers, to say the names of those we have lost, and to remember those who have survived. Amalie Baumann Bloch, born 1910 in Venice, imprisoned in Maxglan, Salzburg, partner of Matthias Krems, who died in Auschwitz-Birkenau, mother of Agatha, Anna, Ernst, and Frida, all of whom died at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Amalie was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau on April 3rd, 1943. Her number was Z6574. She died on June 26, 1944. Ella Vitish Davis, born September 10th, 1934 in Stuttgart, survivor of 8 concentration camps, including Auschwitz-Birkenau, Ravensbrück, Mauthausen, Hamburg, and Bergen-Belsen. Daughter of Alvin Wittisch and Sophie Wittisch, sister of Horst and partner of Curtis Davis Sr. Mother of Belinda Margita Gilmore, Curtis Augusta Davis Jr., Diana Barbie Rosario, Donald Ingo Samuel Wittisch, Yolanda Spragens, Linda, Pamela, Denise, Maggie, and Carmen Swan. Grandmother, great-grandmother. Her number was Z5937. She died on November 12th, 2004 in Columbia, South Carolina. Friends, Ella and Amalie, our aunts, our grandmothers, our kin. Amalie died in Auschwitz-Birkenau along with her entire family. Ella survived. She lived till the age of 70. My act of remembrance today and every day is to say their names, to remember their lives, and to think of those whom they loved. I bring their memories into this room today and into the home that we must continue to build every day for everyone. And we call out the names of each of those whom we remember every time we stand up for rights and dignity of all those people pushed to the margins, denied home, and told you do not belong. Home. I call upon you, as I hope you will call upon me, to continue building home for everyone, for those who have gone before, for the survivors who are still here, for those of us facing war, persecution, insecurity, expulsion, disease, and violence. Let's build a home of belonging, of solidarity, of justice, and of love. Lacho dives, naistuke.
Thank you, Professor Brooks. Our next speaker is Mr. Jacques Grishaver. We are very pleased to have Mr. Grishaver here with his family. Mr. Grishaver was born in Amsterdam on the 20th of March in 1942. He survived the Holocaust because he was hidden by a woman who was not Jewish. He was 3 years old when he came out of hiding. Since 1998, Mr. Grishaver has been the chair of the Dutch Auschwitz Committee. In 2006, he initiated the National Holocaust Monument of Names. 15 years later, in September 2021, the monument was finally unveiled in Amsterdam. Mr. Grishaver has been appointed as Officer of the Order of Orange Nassau. He is recipient of the Golden Order of the Merit of the Republic of Austria and the Gold Medal of the City of Amsterdam. Mr. Grishaver, we are honored to have you here with us today.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jacques Grishaver. I was born in Amsterdam on March 20th, 1942. I am Jewish, and because of that simple fact, my grandfather Isaac had to go into hiding with me. I was barely 1 year old. Most members of my family were murdered in Auschwitz and Sobibor. When the Nazis and fascists came to power and the first measures against the Jews were announced, many thought that things would probably be okay. And as the deportation gradually began, rumors started circulation about what's happening in those dark German camps far away to the east. But it couldn't it? That the Nazis intended to destroy the entire Jewish people was beyond human imagination. Because it was so unimaginable, many of the 140,000 Dutch Jews complied with the German order to wear a yellow star, and eventually also followed the order to report for transport to Camp Westerbork. From there, trains left weekly for Auschwitz and Sobibor. Jews were hunted in the streets. Many went into hiding, finding refuge with brave Dutch families, but just as many were betrayed. Only a few thousand Dutch Jews returned from the camps. After the liberation, a mere 30,000 of once vibrant Jewish community were still alive. In relative terms, the Netherlands had the highest murder rate in Western Europe. While I was hiding with my grandfather, My other grandparents, together with my parents and 2 aunts, were locked up in the Joodse Schouwburg, the Jewish theater, where the Amsterdam Jews were rounded up as a stopover to their way to death. The Jewish resistance fighter Jacques van der Kaag, a friend of my imprisoned grandparents, offered to smuggle them out of the theater building. But instead of choosing to save himself, my grandfather said, "Get my daughter and son-in-law out, because they have a little baby." That little baby was me. That is why, after the liberation, as one of the few Jewish children, I still had my own parents, whom I loved, against whom I rebelled as a teenager, and who molded me into the man I wear today. In our family, we shared the grief of the Shoah, barely able to comprehend what had happened to us. The Dutch Outreach Committee was founded in 1956 by a number of survivors of the extermination camps. When they returned to the Netherlands, they encountered no understanding. They found no place, no compassion. The atmosphere was cold in the Netherlands, the country from which more than 107,000 Jewish residents were deported and only 5,000 returned. The Outreach Committee saw it as its task to tell what had happened and to represent the interests of those who had been murdered. Even today, the Outreach Committee sees Outreach Never Again as a mission to ensure that we never forget and that we continue to warn of where fascism, anti-Semitism and racial delusion can lead. 25 years ago, in 1998, I became chairman of the Dutch Outreach Committee. I made a solemn promise to the committee's founders to continue their legacy, the fight against anti-Semitism, with every fiber of my being. And that fight is still necessary today. Anti-Semitism is rearing its ugly head all over the world, even in the Dutch parliament, where xenophobic nationalists are allied with propagators of insidious conspiracy theories. Resurgent nationalist sentiments form a dangerous breeding ground for the pursuit of ethnic purity, to us and not them, for exclusion and division, like a loud echo from the 20th century. Outreach Never Again is a message that bridges the gap between a period in history when things were so horribly wrong and the present where things can go wrong again. The Dutch Outreach Committee want to keep the memory alive and educate new generations about the dangers of exclusion and discrimination. In September 2021, we unveiled the National Holocaust Monumental Name in Amsterdam, a project I had been fighting for since 2006. It is a chilling and at the same time beautiful memorial designed by Daniel Liebeskind. The more than 102,000 murdered Jews and 220 murdered Roma and Sinti have regained their names and a place in the world in the heart of the Dutch capital. The names of my family members who did not escape from the Jewish theater have also been returned to Amsterdam. Saartje, Isaac, Klaartje, Loesje, Jetje and Betje. Their names, along with thousands of others, serve as a warning to those alive today and to generations to come. As a survivor of the Shoah, I was able to convert my pain and sorrow into energy and commitment to dedicate myself to Outreach Never Again and the creation of the National Holocaust Monument of Name. They have not been forgotten, and they will never be forgotten. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the memorial prayer.
El male rachamim, shoichem amroim. Hametem enocham nechayna, al kanefei hashechina. B'malois kedoshim tehoirim, kezoyar harakia mazhirim. Lenishmois 6 million hayudim, chalelei hashoya beyerapa. Achinu v'achiyoseinu, anu v'shim nushim v'tov, sheyumsu v'sheneherigu, v'shenishtu v'shenidbiyu, v'shenechniku v'shenisrifu chayim al kiddush hashevei. B'Auschwitz-Birkenau, Majdanek, Treblinka, Sobibor, ובשאר מחנויס המובס, מחנויס הוריקוס ויגטוס באירופה, על ידי הצוררים הנאצים ועוזריהם. בעבור שכל העם היהודי וימויסו העולם מתפללים לעילוי נשמעותיהם. מגן עדן, בגן עדן, בגן עדן, תהי מנוח ועשם. לכן באו רחמים, יסתירם בססר כנפיו, לעולמים, ויצרוי בצרוי רחיים, אס שמויסיהם אדוני הוא נחלוסם וינוחו בשלום על משכבי סביביהם ונאמר אמן.
I would like to thank Cantor Nissim Saal for his moving recitation of the memorial prayer. And I would also like to thank Mr. Grishaver for his unfailing commitment to Holocaust remembrance. We appreciate especially very much how you traveled all the way from Amsterdam to be with us today. It is my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Debórah Dwork. Professor Dwork is the director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at the Graduate Center, the City University of New York. Professor Dwork's groundbreaking scholarship, specifically the work she has done related to the narratives of child victims and survivors of the Holocaust, has earned her numerous awards. Her book, Children with a Star, marked a wholly original theoretical development as a child-centered history, opening a fresh area of historical investigation. It is regarded as a classic. Professor Dwork is the recipient of the International Network of Genocide Scholars Lifetime Achievement Award and the Annette Fels-Kupperschmidt Award. She has served as a senior scholar in residence at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and has been a Guggenheim Fellow, a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and a fellow of the American Council of Learned Scholars. She is an academic advisor to our Holocaust and the United Nations outreach program and co-curated the exhibition After the End of the World, Displaced Persons and Displaced Persons Camps with the outreach program. And this exhibition is currently on display here at the United Nations, which we encourage you to visit. Professor Dwork, we are very pleased to have you deliver the 2023 keynote address.
Thank you, and thank you all for your interest and engagement. When the war ended, Maria Elsner and her mother and sister walked and jumped trains from Strashof, where they had served as slave laborers, to their hometown in Hungary. They were convinced that Mr. Elsner had survived. Not only was father not there, the whole house was totally empty. No bed, no table, no chair, no nothing. That was our homecoming. We were there, mother, on the ruins of her life. We imagined that when we returned, we would come back to our old lives. The old life never came back, and we had nothing. Where and to whom did Holocaust survivors belong? Throughout the Nazi era, Jews preserved the hope that their families would be reunited. They presumed that when the Third Reich fell, the old structures and certainties would be restored. As they learned, they were wrong. they returned to naught. Their suffering did not end. It just took another form. Maria Elsner returned expecting unification with her father. By the time Lena Jedwab returned to her native Poland, she held no such hope. Born in Białystok, Lena joined the Communist Youth Organization when the Soviets occupied her city in 1939. The German attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941 found her working as a counselor in a young pioneers' summer camp, which was evacuated to the autonomous Soviet Republic of Udmurtia. Her days, she confided to her diary, passed in unending sorrow and yearning for home. Is home really a cot in a communal dormitory, she exclaimed. No, my home is there on the other side of the front, in Białystok. She adjusted, adapted, conformed, yet she remained isolated. Nobody worries about me, thinks about me, she grieved in September 1943. I will never, ever have a home. Lena wrote to her family in Białystok immediately the city was liberated. But devastating news came in return. 6 September 1944. The pain of waiting has ended with greater pain. All the many letters that I sent to Białystok have been returned with the notation that the addressees are absent. The horror is clear. They all perished. With nothing and no one awaiting her in her homeland, Lena remained in the Soviet Union until attacks against Jews prompted her to seek greater safety in Łódź. She did not find it, and she fled again. Crossing the Polish border clandestinely in August 1948, she made her way to Paris. Survivors faced financial challenges as well as emotional difficulties. The situation of Hannah Ruth Klopstock, a German Jewish child sent to safety in France, reflected the post-war economic conditions of many European Jews, conditions that militated against creating a home or sense of belonging. The sole survivor of her nuclear family, Hannah Ruth remained in France until after the war. Pregnant in 1946, she took a position in a Jewish orphanage to provide for her baby, Gisela. 1954. Sadly, the conditions in which I find myself are not such as to make life easier. Who would have thought at liberation in 1944 that 1954 would be as it has turned out to be? Housing was beyond her reach. She sublet a small room in an apartment. 2 years later, Hannah Ruth worked as a cook in a vocational school, forced to live apart from her daughter Gisela. We still don't have a home. She is in an orphanage near Paris. Mother and daughter visited every Sunday. Hannah Ruth's predicament was not extraordinary. Of the 40,000 Jewish refugees in France in 1940, some 8,000 had survived the war in that country. Those of working age and older had absolutely nothing, no clothing, linens, personal possessions, or housing. all who'd had flats or houses when the Germans invaded had been denied repossession in 1945. And because of the chronic post-war housing shortage, the only accommodation they could obtain were hotel rooms, which typically absorbed half of their meager earnings. Then, too, many survivors were aging and marked by their experience of betrayal by the French state. They would not claim the relief to which they were entitled, fearing expulsion for living on public funds. Jews who had fled to Great Britain fared little better. They had been spared persecution, and as most had been naturalized, their legal situation was stable. Yet their circumstances remained marginal. As a leader of the German Jewish refugee community in Britain observed in 1955, even though the majority are employed, their income is not sufficient to allow them savings. Whatever they had put by in Germany had been lost, and their wages in Britain had not afforded them the opportunity to recoup. Only very few of them can think of retiring, and they dread the day when a breakdown in health would force them to give up their positions. Like survivors everywhere, they had little family to turn to for help. Those basic networks of mutual assistance and care had been destroyed. If older survivors lost their possessions, many younger people were disappointed by the post-war opportunities open to them. Marianka Tzadikov's history plots this story. Marianka and her parents were deported to Theresienstadt, where her father died. She and her mother lived to return to Prague. Family, Jewish community, national identity, all destroyed. I was very close to suicide in 1945. The war was ended in Prague, where you saw nothing but empty windows of people who were dead. Marianka immigrated as a displaced person to the United States in 1947. She hoped for an education, but I never had a chance for schooling. She married. She had 2 daughters. Her family enriched her life. Still, some of us know that under other circumstances, we would have done better. She and her husband had a chicken farm. I had to do with nothing but chickens. For 17 years, no people, never. After her husband died, Marianka, the person who had lit fires and cleaned toilets in Theresienstadt, became a custodian in the public schools. And the next 11 years, I had again no people, because I was cleaning classrooms and bathrooms and throwing away garbage and having absolutely nothing to do with people. The history of Holocaust survivors resists a triumphalist conclusion. They survived, went on, made lives for themselves, and they lost their homes, language, families, roots, and sense of belonging. And at the same time, theirs is a history shaped by resilience and adaptation and marked by loss and a thread of loneliness constructive lives, and lives slightly apart, never quite at home. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dwork, for your thoughtful and important contribution. We pause now to hear composer and singer Ms. Shoshana Shattenkirk perform Hashkiyanu, a traditional Jewish blessing and prayer.
Hashkivenu Adonai, Hashkivenu Adonai, Eloheinu leShalom, V'hamdeinu Shomreinu leChayim. Hashkivenu Adonai, Hashkivenu Adonai, Eloheinu leShalom, V'hamdeinu Shomreinu leChayim. Ufros aleinu Sukkot Shlomecha, Ufros aleinu Sukkot Shlomecha, Ufros aleinu, Ufros aleinu. Sukkot Shlomecha, Hashkivenu Adonai leShalom, Hashkivenu Adonai leChayim. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shattenkirk. It was beautiful. It is important for us to know that work on the history of the Holocaust, which includes the intimate family narratives, is being carried forward through the extraordinary work of scholars and educators such as Professor Dwork and Professor Brooks. We too should appreciate the powerful commitment to Holocaust remembrance and education displayed by the descendants of the victims and survivors of the Holocaust. We have thus invited two guests whose grandparents' lives were upended by the Holocaust. The first is Professor Karen Frostig. From 2013 to 14, Professor Frostig directed the Vienna project that memorialized 7 victim groups murdered under National Socialism. Professor Frostig is the founding director of the Locker of Memory Project, a multimedia memorial project situated at the site of Jungfernhof concentration camp in Latvia. Professor Frostig teaches at Lesley University's Graduate School of Arts and Social Sciences. She is the granddaughter of Holocaust victims, and it is this aspect of her life that we have asked her to reflect on and share with us today. Professor Frostig, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Melissa Fleming. I never met my grandparents, Moses Frostig and Bela Samueli Frostig. 2 small passport photos were on display in our home hanging prominently on a wall in our living room. No one ever talked about these photos. They hung in silence as an open wound. My father, Dr. Benjamin Wolf Frostig, was a young Viennese lawyer. He was arrested by the Gestapo in an early roundup of intelligentsia. Holding an asylum visa to Mexico, my father was expelled from Vienna on June 29, 1938. He was assigned the daunting task to rescue his parents. He did not succeed. Silenced by trauma and shame, my father died in 1971. He never spoke about his heroic journey, gaining asylum for 7 Austrian Jews in Cuba, or his pain. 20 years after his death, I found a small box in my mother's basement. The box held legal documents detailing my father's expulsion from Vienna, multiple deportations, and delayed entry into the United States. In 2004, I received a packet of letters from my cousin, written by my grandparents to my father between 1938 and 1941. Their letters tell a story of love, hope, and persecution. I made numerous trips to Vienna and Riga to recover my family's history. Riga was especially profound. I stood on a neglected patch of land strewn with rubble. This was the unmarked site of the Jungfernhof concentration camp. This ground contained my grandparents' bodies somewhere in an unmarked mass grave. It was a chilling moment, and it was also a moment filled with love and yearning to be close to my grandparents, to protect them with my memory. Since 2010, I have worked closely with the Latvian Jewish community and Latvian officials committed to Holocaust research and remembrance. We have identified information on the 3,985 German and Austrian Jews who were killed at Jungfernhof or at other nearby sites after being deported to Jungfernhof concentration camp in occupied Latvia. We are committed to creating a permanent memorial at Jungfernhof. I envision the memorial as a meeting ground bringing survivors, descendants, leaders, and community members together to grieve while considering hope grounded in memory as a means of transforming this unremembered site into a heartfelt place of remembrance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Frostig, for your deep commitment to the memory, not only of your grandparents, but the community from which they came. And we also note here the support of Latvia, Germany, the United States, and Austria for the work of Professor Frostig, which is a model of positive collaboration between member states in memory of the Holocaust. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations is committed to keeping the memory and history of the Holocaust alive. 2023 marks 90 years since the Nazi Party became the government of Germany and proceeded in dismantling any institutions that might have protected democracy. Hitler's government did not do this in secrecy. The history of the Holocaust illustrates what happens when smoldering coals of hatred are allowed to burst into genocidal flame. The victims of the Holocaust had every right to live lives of dignity without fear, with a place to call home and a sense that they belonged. It is for this reason that we must continue our fight to build a world where everyone feels they belong as equals and can live in peace. the United Nations is committed to combating anti-Semitism, racism, and hate speech. We are committed to Holocaust remembrance and education through initiatives like the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program. Those of you who are here in person will have seen some of the work in action, the exhibitions and the discussions. The work continues throughout the year, including an international youth trial next Tuesday of Nazi eugenicist Ernst Rudin. The outreach program supports the work of the United Nations information centers around the world, which too have organized programs to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust and are engaged in educational and remembrance work all this week and throughout the year. We are part of a wide network determined to remember, to reflect, and to act. We end today with a special contribution from Mr. Michael Shaham, who is the 19-year-old grandson of Holocaust survivor Amnon Shaham. Mr. Amnon Shaham was born Paul Schwartz in 1936 in what is now the Czech Republic. And we are very pleased to know that he is watching this ceremony from his home in Israel. Michael continues the family musical legacy, studying violin at the prestigious Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. And Michael will play Fritz Kreisler's composition, Recitative and Scherzo Caprice, Opus 6. Michael is performing this piece on a very special violin. The violin is part of the Violins of Hope collection, and these are instruments that were played and loved by the victims and survivors of the Holocaust and have been restored by luthier Aman Weinstein, and we thank his son Afshi for helping to bring the violin to us today. The violin Michael is playing once belonged to Hanna de Leo, born in Arnhem in the Netherlands. In 1941, she married Naftali Asher, and a year later, the Nazis occupied the Netherlands. Hanna and Naftali joined the Westerville underground resistance group who organized hiding places for young and old. Soon, however, Hanna and Naftali too were in need of hiding places, and Hanna left her violin with a neighbor for safekeeping. Most of Naftali's and Hannah's family did not survive the Holocaust. Hanna and Naftali did survive, as did their little girl who was born in 1943. And reunited after the war, they spent a year in the Netherlands looking for survivors from their family. In 1946, Hanna and Naftali left Europe for what was then the British Mandate for Palestine, and they took with them their daughter, infant son, and Hannah's cherished violin. Hanna and Naftali settled in Kibbutz Yavne and had 3 more children, Ezra, Eliakim, and Shoshi. We are very pleased to have Shoshi and her husband David with us here today. Welcome. Hannah lived to 101 years old, all her years passionate about music. We listen now to Hannah's violin, played by Mr. Michael Shaham. Thank you very much, Michael, for your eloquent performance, your excellencies, dear survivors, family of survivors, friends. We have come to the close of our remembrance ceremony, and we thank you so much for being with us this morning. Our remembrance inspires our action to collectively build a world in which we can all live in peace and dignity. We wish you a safe journey home. All the best.